Hey everybody and welcome. So in this video we're going to start our series on the Gilded Age. The United States went through a period of time from the late 1870s to the late 1890s. This was called the Gilded Age. This occurred between the Reconstruction era and the Progressive era. It was named by a 1920s historians after Mark Twain's 1973 novel The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. Historians saw late 19th century economic expansion as a time of materialistic accessions marked by widespread political corruption. This was a time for rapid growth, especially in the northern and western United States. As American wages grew much higher than those in Europe, especially for skilled workers, and industrialization demanded an increasingly skilled labor force, the period saw an influx of millions of European immigrants. At this time, the rapid expansion of industrialization led to real wage growth of 40% from 1860 to 1890 and spread across the increasing labor force. The average annual wage per industrial worker, including men, women, and children, rose from $380 in 1880, which is equivalent to $11,998 in 2023 dollars, to $584 in 1890, which is equivalent to $19,126 in 2023 dollars, a gain of 59%. The Gilded Age was also an era of poverty, especially in the South, and growing inequality as millions of immigrants poured into the United States, and a high concentration of wealth became more visible and continuous. The South remained economically devastated after the American Civil War. The region's economy became increasingly tied to commodities like food and building materials, cotton for thread and fabrics, and tobacco production, all of which suffered from low prices. With the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877 and the rise of Jim Crow laws, African American people in the South were stripped of political power and voting rights and were left severely economically disadvantaged. The political landscape was notable in the despite rampant corruption, election turnout was comparatively high among all classes, but it was generally limited to just men. National elections featured two similarly sized parties. The dominant issues were cultural, especially regarding prohibition, education, and ethics or racial groups. Economic issues in the country were also a huge power play by the political parties, turning to tariffs and money supply. Wealthy industrialists and financiers such as John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Flagler, Henry Hustleton Rogers, J.P. Morgan, Leland Stanford, Jacob Schibb, Charles Crooker, and Cornelius Vanderbilt would sometimes be labeled robber barons by their critics, who argued their fortunes were made at the expense of the working class by cincinnati and betrayal of democracy. Their admirers argued that they were captains of the industry who built the core American industrial economy and also the nonprofit sector through acts of philanthropy. For example, Andrew Carnegie donated 90% of his wealth and said that philanthropy was their duty, the gospel of wealth. John D. Rockefeller donated over $500 million to various charities, slightly over half his entire net worth. Reflecting this, many business leaders were influenced by Herbert Spencer's theory, social Darwinism, which justified laissez-faire capitalism. competitors, and social stratification. The unequal distribution of wealth remained high for this period. From 1860 to 1900, the wealthiest 2% of American households owned more than a third of the nation's wealth, while the top 10% owned three-quarters of it. The bottom 40% had no wealth at all. In terms of property, the wealthiest 1% owned 51%, while the bottom 44% claimed 1.1%. Historian Howard Zion argues that this disparity, along with precarious working and living conditions for the working classes, prompted the rise of populist anarchists and socialist movements. Craft-oriented labor unions, such as carpenters, painters, shoemakers, cigar makers, grew steadily in the industrial cities after 1870. These unions used frequent short strikes as a method to attain control over the labor market and fight off competing unions. They generally blocked women, black people, and Chinese from having union membership, but welcomed most European immigrants. Strikes organized by the labor unions became routine events by the 1880s as a gap between the rich and the poor widened. There were 37,000 strikes from 1881 to 1905. In times of desperation, strikes were more violent but less successful because the company was losing money anyway. They were successful in times of prosperity when the company was losing profit and wanted to settle quickly. This period saw several financial crises and economic recessions called panics. Notably, the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893. They lasted several years with high urban unemployment, low income for farmers, low profits for businesses, and slow overall growth and reduced immigration. They generated political unrest.